First, we're going to have to go back in history to even related terminology such as reproductive rights. We'll go back to Tehran in 1968 when the United Nations met and they started to marry the idea of reproductive rights to basic human rights. So here I'm going to quote something where it says, and here's, by the way, a snapshot of the document, that parents have a basic human right to decide freely and responsibly on the number and spacing of children, and a right to adequate education and information in this respect. Now, if we fast forward in 1975, we have another meeting in which the definition is expanded a little bit more in Mexico City during the Women's Conference. They say every couple and every individual has the right to decide freely and responsibly whether or not to have children, as well as to determine their number and spacing, and to have the information, education, and means to do so. So here I would just point out that in the difference between the 1968 and 1975 definition is that we see the inclusion of the option to opt out, whether or not to have children. Fast forward, and during the International Conference on Population and Development, the ICPD, when they met in Cairo in 1994, we have also now an emerging definition on reproductive health in addition to reproductive rights. So here's actually another snapshot of the original document for those who like that sort of thing. And we start to see that reproductive health is defined in paragraph 7.2 as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being in all matters related to the reproductive system, which implies that people are able to have a satisfying and safe sex life and that they have the capability to reproduce and the freedom to choose, or rather to decide, if, when, and how often to do so. So here is this sort of catchy phrase, if, when, and how. It is now finally starting to kind of show up over and over again in the documents you will see moving forward. Here's a little bit of a close-up from that document so you can read it to yourself, and I'll pause so that you can do so. Now, as you can see, Chapter 7 here on reproductive rights and reproductive health, and the paragraph 7.2 highlights a few interesting things, along with this idea of if, when, and how. If meaning it's not necessarily a given that people want to build a family. The next thing is that it articulates the principle of autonomy, and that is also central, and marries it to reproductive rights with human rights, the continued idea from 1968. And it ends with this idea that it must be free of discrimination or coercion or violence. Now, in 1995 in Beijing, in China, we see yet another expansion of the notion of reproductive health. It includes a lot of the definitions from before, but this time it also kind of critically centers the ideas of inequality and inadequacy in the healthcare system. And it also mentions that we should be adopting a more of a life cycle approach to women's health from infancy to old age. It expands the idea little by little. And by the way, this was also the conference named the United Nations Fourth World Conference on Women. So at times, it also, in terms of gender, it sometimes mentions women and sometimes it says men and women. It really depends on the document, but we start to move away from just a gendered understanding that it is for women only. And of course, it still seems to imply heterosexuality as well in terms of building a family. Moving on to 1997, we have a new notion of reproductive justice. So reproductive justice is rooted in the internationally accepted human rights framework created by the UN, And the reproductive justice movement combines, again as well, reproductive rights and social justice this time. The creators of the RJ movement launched it by publishing a historic full-page statement with 800 plus signatures in the Washington Post. And 3 years later, in 1997, Sister Song was formed to create this national multi-ethnic reproductive justice movement. And they define it as the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, to have children, not have children, and parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities with dignity and respect. So here's a little primer, and you see the bullet points is that it combines reproductive rights and social justice. It specifically focuses on the needs and the unique oppression of women of color, Indigenous women, and trans people. And they too see it as a human right, just like the UN. And something I forgot to mention is that over 180 countries had sort of signed this declaration over the years that reproductive rights is a basic human right. I think it's incredibly important before we start teaching anything in the reproductive health space that we understand its history and we understand what many organizing bodies have agreed upon in terms of its definitions and needs. For example, meaning that it is the freedom to decide whether or not to have a family, and to, if, when, and how, to also decide the timing of when these things happen and the structures, and to do so in a way that, despite the disparities and health inequities that are inevitable in the world, or rather that we hope to change, that still we must protect folks from having any kind of coercion in their education, certainly not any violence, and that they should have autonomy in their decision. We also see an expansion of the definition to see it over the course of the lifespan, and I think that's going to have important implications when we work with youth. Here is a way in which you can get in touch with Sister Song through their website.